Dr. Eberly, can you tell us what the big difference is, like between a human being's chronological age and their biological age?
Yeah, so let me start. My name is Dr. George Everly. I'm a public health scholar and a clinical psychologist. My original training in public health had an interesting twist to it. I was interested in neuroscience, so there was actually a human neuroscience laboratory at the school I went to that I attended. And I got very interested in the interaction of mind and body. Now, this is in the 1970s, so this is a little bit ahead of the power curve. The concept of wellness and things like that really hadn't hatched, so to speak. So we were interested in a concept called stress. Now, believe it or not, back in the early 1970s, mid 1970s, stress was not the everyday term it is today. So we even had some difficulty defining it. So when I was finishing my first doctoral training, my advisor and I decided to write a book. And the book was going to be on stress management. We had actually had a class that he developed a few years earlier on stress management. It was called Controlling Stress and Tension. While the focus of the class was on managing this thing called stress, it took a more holistic view. At least it began to. So we wrote this book called, interestingly enough, Controlling Stress and Tension. We took it to a major publisher. The publisher was Prentice Hall. And they said, gee, we really like the concept, but there aren't any college courses on stress, if you can believe that. I mean, stress management courses today are probably the most popular electives on any campus. Didn't exist back then. So they said, well, look, we'll put it in the bookstores first, and then we'll hope that the academic side flourishes. So ultimately, that book was in press for just about 45 years. So we saw the field of stress management grow. But one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of stress management had to flourish just beyond the idea of tamping down stress. So we got into this idea of wellness. It was based on a book by Jonas Salk. Now, people may remember Jonas Salk. He developed the Salk vaccine, which is a vaccination for polio, which saved millions of countless hours of suffering and lives. And as many visionaries are, they start in the science laboratory and then they become philosophers of sorts. And Salk wrote this book called Survival of the Wisest. And he said, we need to stop focusing solely on the treatment of disease. We need to begin to focus on making life better, wellness, beyond illness, beyond just health. Be as well and healthy a person as you possibly can, given your genetic makeups, right? So in 1985, Robert Rosenfeld and I wrote a book called Occupational Health Promotion. It was the first book on how to develop wellness programs in business. And it made sense to us because you spend half of your adult waking life in business settings, either connected to or actually in the setting itself. So as we continued to think about what should go into a wellness program, it was more than just stress management. Believe it or not, we had smoking cessation programs, we had physical exercise, dietary, nutrition programs. But again, a lot of those were still focused on the illness side of the equation. What did we have to do to think beyond that? So here's where your question comes in. Here's where the idea of biological versus chronological age. The practical extension of wellness has to be some meaningful metric. So we began developing personal health profiles where we would assess people, and sometimes we would draw blood, sometimes we'd do 12 lead EKGs, but most of it was behavioral assessments, surveys. And we wanted a metric that would resonate with people. So just to say that your blood pressure was 120 over 70 probably wasn't very exciting. Or or your high density lipoprotein level is X probably wasn't very exciting. So we wanted to translate it into something that was a bit of a grabber. And Shaq, you grabbed it, okay? What's a meaningful term that someone who's not a biologist would term that would resonate well? Well, we all know we have chronologic age. Starts the day you're born, ends the day you die, measured in years. That's a metric everybody gets. Okay. But what's this other age? What's this biological age? And people used to think that biological age and chronological age were exactly the same. They're not.
Yeah.
Is it possible that your biological age could be greater than your chronologic age? Well, we know that there are certain careers that seem to accelerate the aging process. At least people complain in their 40s and 50s of illnesses or problems that you'd expect in somebody's 70s, 80s, or 90s. So he has some anecdotal hints that maybe biologic and chronologic ages were not the same. Well, that was an enticing notion, because if biological age could exceed chronologic age, could we do the opposite? Could we slow it down? Have you ever heard the term, you look good for your age?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, isn't that a reference to the notion that there is a split in ages? That someone says, gee, you look better than your chronologic age. Well, maybe that's saying your biologic age is less than your chronologic age. So we have all these references. We just didn't put it in a package. So the notion of a chronologic age being different than your biologic age, I think, is really kind of cool. We kind of just gave it away that there were certain professions, for example, law enforcement, fire suppression, emergency medicine, actually working in the transportation industries, seem to be careers that are associated with an acceleration of the aging process, so that the biologic age is higher than the chronologic age. But what probably the reason we're having this discussion is not to just point our fingers and say, oh my golly, isn't that terrible? There are certain careers I might want to avoid. No, there are certain things that perhaps we can do that will create a distance between my biologic age and my chronologic age, but that will favor me. So there are people that want to be in law enforcement and fire suppression and transportation industry and healthcare, but they don't want to suffer the acceleration of the aging process. Is there anything we can do for them? Mm-hmm. Well, if indeed there is a separation between chronologic age and biologic age, hopefully the answer is yes. So chronologic age, your years on a calendar. Biologic age is probably the ticking, I should say, clock of your life. When your biologic age ends, you die. Will it be at age 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 or 100? The good news is we used to think that was just genetically predetermined, absent certain events in life. Now we're beginning to think maybe we can slow down the aging that we call biological aging, so that if you pass away from natural causes, in other words, your biologic clock has been extinguished, it's going to be longer in chronologic years rather than shorter. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, for sure. Now, what are the factors that make up a person's biological age? What are we focusing on? Because obviously, there are many things that we can talk about, right? But if you had to kind of, I guess, narrow it down to things that um, do contribute the most to a person's biological age, what would that be?
All right, so let's continue our story. So our story was we were in search of following Salk's notion of we want to be more than just absent disease. We want to be exquisitely healthy. That's the first step. The second step was we were looking for a metric that resonated with people. And that's the idea of separating biologic age from chronologic age. So it's kind of cool, Shaq, because you can take a snapshot and see that your biologic age has increased or decreased, and you can do that on a once a month basis. But you don't want to do it too soon. But once a month, once every 3 months, a quarter or something. So the next step in our story now has to be, we know how to measure chronologic age. That's simple. Look at the calendar. But how do you measure biologic age? And therein lies the challenge. So there are 3 ways, and I discussed them in that paper you referenced. So there's a journal called crisisjournal.org, one word, crisisjournal.org. And last month I published a paper called Longevity Focused Wellness Toward a Revolution in Workplace Wellness. Can we slow down the aging process? So in that paper, I discuss metrics. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated because it's not as easy as just looking at the calendar. So what we're doing is we're looking at things that we think at the cellular level and maybe subcellular level are indicative of the calendar, if you would. So it's kind of like our biological calendar. So what are those things? One is telomere length. One is DNA methylation, and the other is oxidative stress. Now, so of course it begs the question, what the heck are those things? Mm-hmm. So let's start with oxidative stress,
okay,
which is probably the easiest thing and thing that most people can relate to if they're into the health and wellness space. So the process of living and breathing involves something called oxidation. So when you inhale and you take in oxygen, it has effects on cells. It's part of the energy process. And what happens, as we would know with any other process, biological process, there is input and there is waste. So there's input, output, and waste, right? And one of the things that happens under the kind of waste category is that when oxidation occurs, an electron is freed from molecules. And that electron is called a free radical. And that free radical is capable of doing damage. But that's potential. So oxidation and the freeing up of the free radicals is just a natural process. Can't do anything about that. What is oxidative stress, which is different? Stress is when the free radicals, the number of free radical molecules, outweigh or outnumber the number of free radical scavengers. Mm-hmm. So the good news is that Mother Nature has built in a vacuum cleaning system that sees these free radicals and grabs them and gobbles them up before it can, I'm using metaphors, obviously.
Yeah.
Gobbles them up before they can do damage. So these free radical electrons are at the source kind of the damage. Where do we actually look to see that damage? We can look at things called telomeres, and that's probably the one I want to focus on. It's easiest. The telomeres are little caps on chromosomes. So at the genomic level, we have these things called chromosomes, and they are a winding of the DNA string. Well, the the DNA terminates, and to keep, this sounds a little weird, to keep the DNA from unraveling, Mother Nature puts a little cap at the end of it. And that cap is called a telomere. So the cap protects the DNA. It protects your genetic integrity. It protects you against cancers, for example. So why are we more vulnerable to cancer as we age? Our natural cancer protection mechanisms are weakening. And one of those weakening mechanisms is that the telomeres are shortening. And then when they shorten and they shorten and they shorten and they shorten, and then they go away. And now the DNA is vulnerable to all attacks of all kinds. So the telomeres are this protective armor that protects our genetic system. You can actually measure telomere length. And that's the cool thing. So that's our metric. That's our core metric. We want to see how much damage the oxidative stress process is doing, accelerating our aging process. We look at the telomeres. So there are things that we can do, and your listeners have probably heard of the concept of antioxidants.
Yeah.
It got very famous when we looked at diets like the Mediterranean diet. They were saying, why is that people that have risk for similar risk for aging and degeneration seem to have slowed down the aging process? What's going on? And they had this diet, and it was high. It turned out it's high in antioxidants, especially things called polyphenols. And polyphenols are highly represented in certain types of red wine, certain vegetables, certain fruit, things like that. So the speculation was that the secret, anti-aging secret, resided in these antioxidants that resided in the diet. But the good news is we've discovered that there are other ways of slowing down the aging process from an antioxidant standpoint beyond just diet. And Dean Ornish was one of the pioneers looking at this holistic system. I think his book was called Undo It, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, let me look at my notes to make sure I didn't misrepresent that. But he took a look at a holistic, primarily diet approach. And then beyond Dean Ornish's pioneering work in the 1980s, you saw people like Peter Attia and David Sinclair. So if there were three books I'd read, if your audience is interested, it would be Peter Satia's book, David Sinclair's book, and Dean Ornish's book. I mean, that to me would be the library of aging and anti-aging. Just brilliant work in all of them.
Got it. Okay, yeah. So this whole information on telomeres to me is really interesting because, I mean, it's not something that's really well known, right? So let's just focus on that a bit more. Now, are some people born with, more resilient telomeres? Because, like, you'll see some people, sometimes they'll have habits that aren't healthy, right? Like, lots of smoking, lots of drinking, but for some reason they still manage to stay pretty healthy as time goes on, right? So does that have something to do with their telomeres, or is it just luck in that regard?
I don't think it's luck. I'm not sure it's exactly at the telomere level. It may be more at the oxidative stress level. I remember when I was growing up, one of my best friends' grandfather lived to be mid-90s. And of course, they were always saying, what's the secret of your longevity and things? And he says, well, I smoke a pack of cigarettes every day and I have 2 shots of scotch every day. And people said jokingly, I don't think anybody believed that was helping. But the dangerous message was it wasn't hurting.
Yeah.
One of the things that we certainly know accelerates the aging process through the oxidative stress mechanism is tobacco use, especially smoking, and alcohol. I mean, if there are two things on the top of your how to age beyond your chronologic age, it's smoke and drink alcohol. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yeah.
So in his case, the grandfather's case, it was not so much that the alcohol and the smoking wasn't hurting him. It was probably, and again, this is just hindsight speculation, it was just that he had such a strong genetic constitution that he lived long in spite of the smoking, not because of the smoking. And the in spite of was that he probably just didn't have any other genetic risk factors. Remember, there are genes for dementia, for example. There are genes for certain types of cancer in a way. So that sounds very fatalistic, doesn't it? But here's the good news. There seems to be some evidence that genes do not have to express themselves. So there are things that we can do that may, let's take dementia, for example. Dementia is the most costly form of disease that we are aware of. It, at this point, it's not number one in terms of source of death, but it is number one in terms of cost of illness. So some folks have a genetic bias to developing dementia. And this isn't rocket science. You can probably look back in your family tree to find out how many folks passed away or showed evidence of dementia. But that doesn't mean you have to pass away from it. So there is some evidence that physical exercise, 30 minutes an epoch 3 times a week, so moderate exercise, can reduce the risk of that gene expressing itself. There are risk factors for hyperlipidemia, but there's and one of them is genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember a name, Peter Fix?
That sounds really familiar.
So Peter Fix wrote the first runaway best-selling wellness book, but he focused on just one dimension. He wrote the complete book of running. Not to be, no pun intended, it was a runaway bestseller. So my book, Controlling Stress and Tension, and his book, Jim's book, The Complete Book of Running, came out about the same time. And I ran into him in New Orleans. And we were at a raw bar. And I was waiting for my wife to come down, and we were going to go out to dinner. But I said, I'm going to go down and have some oysters or something. And so I run into Jim Fix, and Jim really enjoyed eating the seafood. And I said, Jim, you really enjoy the seafood? And he said, yeah. And you know what's interesting is I have a genetic risk for heart disease. And I said, so why are you doing this? He said, because I run, whatever, I don't remember the metric. It was something like 5 miles a day or whatever it was. And he said, that protects me. And I said, oh, really? Now remember, this is I'm going to guess 1978, 1979. Something like that. And I said, I'm not sure I'd take that risk, but it's your life, whatever. So we had a great conversation. My wife came down, we went out to dinner. I never saw Jim again. He died 2 years later while running.
Really?
From heart disease. Heart disease. So there are some things that you can do behaviorally to reduce your risk. And some other things have to be risk specific. So in the case of dementia, there's evidence that physical exercise can reduce the risk even though you may have the gene. This is what we believe, at least. In the case of hyperlipidemia, exercise may help, but a far more targeted intervention would have been what? Changing your diet, which again goes back to Dean Ornish's work. And he basically argued that chronic diseases can be reversed through comprehensive lifestyle changes. And if you compare that to Peter Attia's work, his notion, chronic diseases, he really believes in early detection. He really believes in exercise. But Sinclair's work was different. Sinclair's work is looking at reducing those genetic risks by what, for lack of a better word, would be epigenetic programming. In other words, keeping the bad genes from expressing themselves. Mm-hmm. And so while Dean Ornish's work and Peter Attia's work focuses a lot on lifestyle and behavioral things, Sinclair's work focuses on his research on sirtuins and working at the molecular level. Sinclair, some of your audience will be familiar with one of the most popular supplements on the market, which is nicotinamide riboside, or NAD+. His work has probably led to the popularization of NAD+. Now, there is evidence that NAD+ may reduce your risk for basal cell carcinomas. So even though you were fair-skinned and you were in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and you were out in the sun without sunscreen, and now you've got all this potential for basal cell carcinomas, there's some evidence that the NAD+ may keep that propensity from expressing itself, which I think is really exciting. So Sinclair's work is more attuned to my thinking of, can we do something at the cellular level?
Okay, now, is this prior to birth or after birth? Because when you talk about programming, what's going on there? Like what kind of programming is it?
So the programming that's an interesting question. So once you're born, I mean, that horse has left the barn, the pre-birth opportunity is gone. Yeah. So everything we're talking about is after birth, and your genetic matrix is now laid down. Whether it expresses itself or not is now the question. But your question begs another question, which is, can the health of the mother affect the genetic programming of the fetus, the child that's about to be born? We know that there are certain things that the mother can do that can harm that. What we don't know, are there certain things, and your question's interesting in that sense, are there certain things the mother can do that, I use the term not in the vaccination sense, but immunize that child in the womb? Wouldn't that be cool? Yeah. I just don't know the answer.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that there are things that the mother can do to harm the baby in this case, right? What are those things?
Because the two at the top of the list are what we mentioned before, which is alcohol and smoking. But if you take a look at, let's go beyond just the mother. Let's generate a list of things that accelerate the aging process, accelerate the biological aging process. Mm-hmm. So let's make two lists. One that accelerates and one that decelerates, or maybe, not only slows down, there's some intriguing evidence that maybe telomere degradation can be reversed, not just slowed down. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
But let's take a look at the things that are factors that will accelerate your biologic aging. So tobacco and alcohol consumption, top of the list, as far as we know. Now, in fairness, to my knowledge, these are not randomized controlled trials. So these are the evidence is what public health scholars would rely on, which is more epidemiologic data. So we can't say there is a direct cause without the randomized controlled trial, but you can say there's an association. So tobacco use, alcohol consumption associated with shortening of telomeres. Irregular, unrestful sleep patterns. We take sleep for granted. And yet there's some evidence that if you don't get restful sleep over the course of an extended period of time, you actually increase your risk of dementia by perhaps as much as 60%, which is shocking. Stress. This good old stress, the adrenaline rush. The acute adrenaline rush, probably not a problem. The chronic adrenaline rush, and you've probably heard of the hormone cortisol. In the short run, very helpful. In the long run, a really nasty hormone. Breaks down tissue, can kill brain cells. Highly refined sugars, highly refined flour appear to be associated with acceleration of aging as measured by telomeres or DNA methylation. Chronic high doses of stimulants such as caffeine. What's interesting, because moderate doses of coffee use seem to be protective. So it's a classic curvilinear relationship. None, not so good. A little bit to moderate, good. Too much, really bad. Kind of like chocolate cake. I mean, I'm a chocolate cake guy. So, a little bit of chocolate cake, good, hits the spot. Try to eat an entire chocolate cake. I mean, I'm 170 pounds. I just can't do it. Yeah, it's going to make me sick. One of the things that has gone hiding in plain sight is, change gears a little bit, the gut biome, the relationship between your gastrointestinal system and your overall health. We are just beginning to understand that as you age, as you engage in certain behaviors, there can be leakage, sounds a little gross, leakage from the gut into the bloodstream. This causes chronic inflammation and a wide variety of illnesses that go low level, perhaps chronic, increasing the burden of your life, often misdiagnosed, typically misdiagnosed as something else because we're looking for an external pathogen. Last place we're looking is gut leakage. So there's some fascinating clinical evidence to say things that we can do to reduce inflammation, chronic systemic inflammation, can do a lot to promote, I think, a deceleration of that aging process. Ultraviolet light, sunlight, of course, we know that's associated with skin cancer, don't we? And this one may come as a surprise, social isolation. It's been argued that we are in the middle of an epidemic of social isolation. Research tells us that the single best predictor of resilience is connected to other people. So when we see psychological surveys telling us that Gen Z and others are socially isolated, it is not surprising that we also see that higher levels of anxiety and depression than in other generations. So that's our kind of don't do list.
Got it. And what would the second list be for things that you should do? Obviously, you mentioned get consistent exercise, diet, but like outside of those two things, what else can people do?
Excuse me. So let's not underestimate, again, the power of exercise. We used to think that physical exercise was just good for cardiopulmonary. I mean, if I go way back, there were two types of exercise. There was aerobic exercise, kind of like running, jogging, quick walking. And there was anaerobic exercise. The classic was weightlifting. And back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, never the twain shall meet. You did one or you did the other.
Really?
So, yeah, we're going back in history here. So, I used to be a competitive weightlifter. So, we would not run. And then a few of us got together and we started thinking, you know, after we spend 4 hours in the gym lifting weights, what we're going to do is we're going to go run. And that's what we did. So we'd run 2 miles after. And people looked at, well, that's kind of weird because aren't you undoing the weightlifting? No, you're not, actually. I mean, there was a lot of mythology back then. And it even went back to the notion if you lift weights, you get muscle bound and you lose flexibility, which is, of course, not true.
Uh-huh.
If you stretch, obviously. So cardiopulmonary benefits, bone density benefits, really important for women after their estrogen levels drop, obviously, right? But fragility may be the number one cause of premature death in the elderly, because fragility leads to falls, and falls lead to other problems that generally shorten the lifespan. So we are now learning that, okay, there are really good benefits from exercise physically, but now we're learning that the exercise affects even the telomeres. So that's really, really exciting. So dietary, obviously, we talked about refined sugars, refined flour, but the positive things were the polyphenols. There really does seem, and Sinclair's lab focuses on something called the sirtuins, and the polyphenols are high in sirtuins. Resveratrol is another supplement that has gained popularity in addition to NAD+. So foods or supplements that contain polyphenols seem to have some benefit. The omega-3 fatty acids seem to be in a class almost by themselves. So people that have high seafood diets, they're rich in omega-3 fatty acids, absent mercury, please, seem to be helpful. Now let's get into some of the other behavioral kinds of things. So in the 1970s, the Boston area, Massachusetts area, was the center of trying to understand behavioral approaches to wellness. And John Kabat-Zinn was famous for developing what he called mindfulness programs. And Herbert Benson was famous for his book, The Relaxation Response, where he talked about mantra meditation. Both mindfulness and meditation appear to have remarkably useful effects. Mindfulness may be easier to implement than mantra meditation, because mantra meditation typically takes 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, hopefully 7 days a week. But when we studied this, what we discovered was after a year, only 10% of meditators were still meditating, at least in this one study. And we asked people why, and they said, honestly, it's boring. So what we then developed and we published papers on was using a 10-minute deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing technique, 4 days or more a week. And we actually found, and the paper was published in that crisisjournal.org, Dr. Jeffrey Lating and I published it last year or the year before, taking a look at some actual, what we would stretch the term a little bit and call behavioral immunity to stress. by simply practicing 10 minutes of this breathing exercise a day. Vitamins. Linus Pauling, a 2-time Nobel Prize winner. First one was in chemistry, but physiology, medicine, but for chemistry. And he said, and he was laughed at, a Nobel laureate was laughed at when he said vitamin C can positively impact the common cold. It may be a viricide. And it turns out that it doesn't totally prevent it, and it doesn't cure it, but it appears to reduce the risk. And when you do get the common cold, it seems to reduce the severity of it. And the good news is vitamin C is a water-soluble vitamin, as opposed to another vitamin, which is helpful, but is fat-soluble, vitamin D. So moderate coffee consumption appears to be protective. May actually add up to 5 years to your life expectancy. But I think tea, the data are supportive of tea as well, especially green tea. Black tea, okay. Green tea, daily consumption of green tea. And the opposite of social isolation is the last one, which is interpersonal support. Who's got your back? Why is it that people that live alone, even though they want to live alone, may find their lives more stressful than people that have a support system? It may be that if you go through life by yourself, you have to worry about everything all the time. Everything all the time. And that means you're hypervigilant and you got to take care of everything yourself. It's nice to have someone in your corner. It's nice to have an advocate. It's nice to have somebody who can help pick you up when you fall down in life. So that's kind of our list of things that seem to be helpful.
Got it. Okay. Dr. Everly, thank you so much. That's a lot of great information. I know we only have 2 minutes left here. Can I ask just one more small question just before we leave?
Yeah.
Okay. If people want to check their current biological age or their current standing of their specific telomeres, where would you tell them to go and get that checked?
I would go to, I'd start with their primary care physician and discuss it with them. And then if they're not particularly satisfied, I'd ask that person, do you know anybody that may be sometimes called a longevity physician? Someone who not only understands the practice of medicine, internal medicine, general medicine, but somebody that is focused also on longevity. And I know just where I live, there are several physicians that literally describe their practices as longevity practices or themselves as longevity-oriented physicians. Because the telomeres and things like that can be measured, but they are medical analytic tests that need to be prescribed. There's also, again, I'm not being paid to plug any book or any other thing.
Yeah.
So there is a foundation that I have found very useful. It's called the Life Extension Foundation. And they put out I think it's a monthly magazine. Now, they do sell a lot of products. That's their business. So just understand that. But I subscribe to their magazine, and it's a very, in my opinion, it's very well researched. I've read the articles, but more so, everything is very well, meticulously referenced. So if they say, for example, vitamin C reduces the intensity of a cold, they will cite it. I don't take that for granted. That's not what I do. I read the primary sources. So I will look up the primary research, and they get it right, usually. So I found that to be a credible source. I also noticed it seems like that not only do they sell supplements, but they sell various assessment tools and the like. So again, that is a commercial venture. I'm not pushing them, not advocating them, just saying I have found them to be a useful resource.
Got it. No problem. No problem. And if people want to go and find your work, where would you tell them to go?
Oh, golly. Um, uh, if you're into the scholarly stuff, you can go to Google Scholar and just put in my name, George Everly, and you'll find probably a couple hundred journal articles. If you're interested in not so much the scientific stuff, but the translation, practical stuff, um, we have a book coming out in 2 weeks called the Johns Hopkins Guide to Everyday Psychological First Aid. And that's about helping people with psychological bumps and bruises, friends, family members, and the like. If you're interested in the science of wellness, there's a book called A Clinical Guide to the Treatment of the Human Stress Response. And that has been an academic bestseller for 40 years, actually. It's still in print. The latest version is 2019. 600 pages, 3,000 references. But the good news is it assumes no background in biology whatsoever. It just says the first half of the book is, this is what stress and health is. And the second half of the book is very specific on how do you learn to that breathing technique, for example, is in there. What are some dietary guidelines? What are exercise guidelines? So that book has, like I said, been in print for over 40 years. So it must still be doing something right. There's a book called Stronger, where we took a look at case studies of people that were extraordinarily resilient. But the best book is a book by Jim McCann, McCann, and myself. Came out about 15 months or so ago. It's called Lodestar. And what we did is we took a look at the best-selling self-help books over the last, you ready, 100 years, and we read them. And we extracted the suggestions that we thought were scientifically valid from the suggestions that we thought maybe weren't. And we took the scientifically valid ones and we put them in one book. So it's kind of it's one quick little read, very easy to read. It was actually a USA Today national bestseller when it came out. So again, Lodestar, Lodestar. Those would be the books I would recommend.
God, yeah, that's great. And if you want, you can send me your links, and I'll just post it down below, and people can go and check it out if they'd like, just to make it easier for them.
Okay.
Okay, then?
Great.
All right. Dr. Everly, thank you so much. This was really fun. A lot of interesting new information here. So I know, we didn't have much time together, but, this episode was great, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on the show. Thank you, sir.
No problem. No problem.